If you've been sticking with me over the past few days, we've been looking at a covenant that God made with Abraham. We got to the covenant yesterday, specifically in Genesis 22. We're going to go back to that here in just a moment. And we're going to see how Paul says we are connected to that covenant. Not replacing Israel, but that we have this covenant that God made that we get to participate in. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and in our larger study, we're looking at the ministry of the Spirit, and right now we've been looking at the fact that the Spirit has placed us into Christ. And in Christ, we are going to share, we're going to see here in a moment, in one of the promises that God made to Abraham. We keep coming back to Galatians chapter 3, verse 15, because Paul sets down here what we might call some covenant law. That is, that once a covenant's made, you don't set it aside and you don't add to it. And then he tells us that the covenant was made to Abraham, to his seed, but he doesn't say to seeds as though referring to many, but referring to one, to your seed, who is Christ. And we've looked at a covenant that God made in Genesis 15, two covenants that God makes in Genesis 17, one covenant that he makes and one covenant that is a covenant that's bilateral. It has responsibilities on both sides. And then yesterday we came to Genesis 22. So let's look over in Genesis 22. It says in verse 15, "And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn." Now, the only time that we have reference to God swearing a covenant is here in Genesis 22. It's not called a covenant here, but it is called a covenant that God swore in Genesis 26 when God speaks with Abraham's son Isaac. It is called a covenant that God swore when David quotes this over in Psalm 105. And he says that he swore this covenant. And Paul makes reference to God swearing this over in Hebrews chapter 6. You may not agree that Paul wrote Hebrews. That's beside the point. But here in Luke chapter 1, where we have Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, he says that God is visiting his people to show mercy toward our fathers and to remember his holy covenant, the oath which he swore to Abraham our father, to grant us that we, being rescued from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear. Now, you don't have that in the other covenants, but you do have that quoted, referenced in the covenant in Genesis 22, if we go back over here, where he says that he's going to multiply them as the offspring as the stars of the heaven. And this is the only covenant that he makes that statement about their being multiplied like the stars of the heaven. In Genesis 15, he says if you can count the stars, you could count your offspring. But he doesn't say they are like the stars of the heaven there. But he also says, and like the sand that is on the seashore. This alone is tied to this, and when it's quoted in other passages, it references these statements. And your offspring then shall possess the gates of his enemies. And we've been over this. This is a singular pronoun. This singular pronoun refers to Christ, and this is exactly the point Paul is making over in Galatians chapter 3, is Christ. Now, how is this multiplied? How is this a multiplied seed, as he says over here in Genesis 22, that he's going to multiply his offspring like the stars of the heaven, and yet it's a singular offspring, which Paul says in Galatians chapter 3 is Christ. In very short order, if we go down to the end of the chapter, he uses himself as a Jew, as an Israeli, and he refers to the fact that when they were under the law was like a guardian. It was like somebody that led them around by the hand, making sure they made it back and forth to school and avoided getting into trouble. And they did that until Christ, so that we could be justified by faith. But since the faith has come, now Paul is saying here in verse 25, now that the faith has come, now that we're believing in Christ. See, these Old Testament people were not believing in Jesus Christ. They didn't know. They knew that there was this coming anointed king, but that wasn't really the object of their faith. They weren't believing that he was going to die for their sins, be buried, and rise again. That's what we believe. That's not what they were believing. And says, but since that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. We don't have somebody leading us around. In other words, we're not under the law. And here's the reason, for you are all sons. And later in the book, Paul's going to make the point, if you're being led by the Spirit, if the Spirit is leading you, if he's directing you to your position in Christ, if this is the work of the Spirit in your life, you're functioning like a son and you're not under law. A son is not under law. This is his point. For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. This is where you're a son. You're a son in Christ Jesus. And we have a number of scriptures that tell us that that's where God has caused us to be his sons, is in Christ. Verse 27, and as many of you have been baptized into Christ. This isn't water baptism. This is the baptism that the Spirit enacted the very moment you believed, that the Spirit took and put you into Christ. And you've put Christ on like a garment, which is something they would have related to. Israelis would have recognized this idea, this initiation into a different status, but the Greek or the Roman people especially would have recognized this as putting on this garment, this robe they put on over the top that marked them now as a citizen, as a son, graduated from the status of being a male child to actually being a son. And verse 28 is such a beautiful statement now. There is no Jew or Greek, and we could say with this statement, literally, in him, in it, or in him probably, because we're talking about in being in Christ, there's no Jew or Greek. Again, in him, there's no slave or free. In him, there's no male or female. For you are all one thing in Christ Jesus. What is that one thing? You're all that one seed. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. There he is. That thing that he was set up above there. He's talking about that seed. See, you're all one seed. We're not each one of us an individual heir. We're all heirs together as a singular seed in Christ. We are one. We've been over this in our studies in the past here, that Paul tells us that we are one new man. All of us are together. All of us believers as New Testament believers are all united as one whole new kind of man. And our identity as a Jew or Greek is gone. Our identity as a slave or free person is gone. Our identity as a male or female is gone, because we are part of this new man in Christ. And if we're that, we are Abraham's seed and then heirs according to the promise. An heir of that promise that he made back here in Genesis 22. This promise that he said back here, that the heir would possess the gates of his enemies. We are those that have been freed from the dominion of Satan. We no longer are under fear. We are those who are free from the dominion of our sinful nature. And we're free from the dominion of the world system. Now, it doesn't mean we always live free of it. But we have the potential, because he has defeated our flesh. He has defeated Satan, and he has defeated the world system. And in him, when we operate in Christ, we get to enjoy that promise. And we are Abraham's seed. Only in this relationship. We are not spiritual Israel. We are Abraham's seed because we are one in Christ. There's the promise. And it only relates to that one covenant. We're not inheriting any land. We're not doing anything like that. We are inheriting as an heir the promise of possessing the gate of our enemies. Not just one enemy, enemies. Beautiful, beautiful promise. You don't have to be dominated by any of your spiritual enemies as a believer. Christ has secured our freedom, which is the point in the book of Galatians, that if you would follow the Spirit's lead, if you would allow the Spirit to be directing your life and directing you to who you are as a believer in Christ, you would experience this freedom, which includes also freedom from the yoke of the law, which he states in Galatians 5:1. I trust that encourages you today. Something else to set your mind on. We'll come back and we'll flesh a little bit more of this out in a future study here. But I trust that encourages you to set your mind on who you are in Christ and realize that you're a part of this seed. Thank you for joining me today.